Why did they think she was late? The war had already begun breathing down their necks long before her shadow stretched across the ridge. The valley was alive with violence, smoke plumes curling upward, artillery echoing through the mountainsides, radios stuttering with clipped voices that barely held together. The air itself seemed bruised, carrying with it the acrid sting of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood, faint yet inescapable. At the forward command post, men clutched their rifles like drowning men cling to driftwood. Some prayed silently, others cursed. All of them, though they wouldn't admit it out loud, were waiting for her. But when the minutes dragged, when the horizon revealed only dust and fire, the whispers started. She's not coming. She's late. Figures always thought she was overrated. The words slipped like cracks in stone, spreading fast, and yet beneath the doubt there was something unspoken. They remembered her name. They remembered the stories. They remembered how battles in the past had turned when she stepped onto the field. That's why the disappointment stung so much. Hope had been pinned on her, whether they admitted it or not. What they didn't know was that she was closer than they imagined, and every step she took carried a weight heavier than the gear strapped to her body. She moved alone. Her boots pressed into soil still trembling from impact. Loose gravel scattered down the incline with each footfall. Her breathing came steady but deliberate, measured against the rhythm of a woman who had learned long ago to count steps as if each one was a vow. The pack across her shoulders pulled her spine downward. Her rifle knocked gently against her side, the strap worn thin from years of wear. Her gloves, though fitted, carried faint stains, the kind that don't wash out no matter how many times you scrub. But it wasn't the gear that slowed her. It was the ache in her chest, not the physical kind, though her muscles screamed and her lungs burned. No, this ache lived deeper. It was the ache of someone walking toward a place she had already seen too many times in her dreams. She should have been here earlier. That's what they would all say. She should have crossed the valley faster. She should have ignored the hesitation that gnawed at her before dawn, when the horizon turned gold and she froze, not from fear of battle but from memory. Because memory is heavier than any weapon. Hours earlier, before the first artillery shell cracked open the valley floor, she had stopped on a ridge to watch the sunrise. It had been the kind of sunrise that painted the sky in raw fire, bleeding light across the jagged mountain edges. For others, it would have been breathtaking. For her, it was haunting. She had stood there, boots rooted, unable to look away. Because that sunrise was the same as 1 year ago, the morning she had made a promise that still burned through her veins like wildfire. The photograph in her pack reminded her of it every day. She hadn't told them. None of them knew. They thought her silence meant she was cold, detached, mechanical in the way she moved through missions. But silence can hold more than detachment. Sometimes silence is the only shield left against grief. Her delay wasn't hesitation. It was memory pressing against her ribs until she couldn't breathe. She pulled herself from it only when the radio at her shoulder crackled, static breaking into voices that were too frantic to mistake. Orders barked, positions failing, men screaming beneath the collapse of their own faith. That was when she adjusted her pack, pulled the strap tighter against her chest, and started walking again. At the command post, the atmosphere felt like a room where the oxygen was running out. Maps were spread wide across steel, black arrows and red circles, colliding in ways that no longer mattered because reality shifted faster than anyone could draw. Radios bled constant noise, half-words, broken syllables, the frantic edge of men losing ground. A lieutenant leaned across the table, eyes wild. He slammed his fist against the steel. "She's not here. She was supposed to be here an hour ago." No one answered at first. The silence was louder than the shellfire in the distance. Finally, Sergeant Hale lit a cigarette with hands that didn't shake. The smoke curled upward, slow and indifferent, a small rebellion against the urgency that filled every breath in the room. "She'll come," Hale said flatly. The lieutenant scoffed, his laugh jagged. "And what if she does? What if this time the myth doesn't walk through the smoke?" Hale didn't look up. He exhaled smoke instead, letting it trail into the air between them. "Then we fight without her, but I'd rather fight this one with her shadow than without it." The room went still again, because even the doubters, the loudest voices, the harshest critics, knew the truth behind Hale's words. She had turned the tide before, not by force alone, not by some miracle shot or cinematic rescue, but by presence, by the way her silence steadied others, by the way she carried something unseen but undeniable into every battle. And that was why the whispers cut so deep. They weren't angry she was late. They were afraid she wouldn't come at all. She could feel that fear across the distance. Not the words, she couldn't hear those. But fear has a tone, and it travels even through static. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she moved, not in anger, not in pride, just in the ache of being misunderstood, of always being the question mark in other people's sentences, the one they doubted until the very last moment. Her rifle tapped softly against her side with each stride. She ran her fingers across the stock, brushing against scratches carved by time. Every mark told a story, nights she'd survived when no one else had, hours spent alone in silence, moments when the rifle's steady weight was the only thing that tethered her. But today wasn't about the rifle. Today was about something far heavier. Beyond the ridge was the valley. Beyond the valley, men who thought she had failed them. And beyond that, a truth no one else knew. Because for her, this mission wasn't about orders anymore. It was about a name, a promise, a grave long forgotten by others but never by her. Closer now. She slowed near the ridge, dropping to one knee, scanning the valley below with eyes that caught details others missed. Smoke lifted from craters, uneven, too thick in places where fires had spread uncontrolled. Movement on the left flank stuttered, a line bending inward. Soldiers fell back inch by inch, some crawling, some dragged. Her jaw tightened, the line was faltering. For a moment she didn't move, just watched, the kind of stillness that feels like eternity compressed into seconds. She could walk away, right now. No one would know why, they'd only know she never came. The story would write itself in whispers and reports, and she would remain a ghost in someone else's narrative. But ghosts can choose. Her hand slipped into the side pocket of her pack. Her fingers brushed against fabric, not rough canvas but soft cloth, folded carefully. She pulled it free. The photograph. The edges frayed, the corners bent from too many times folding and unfolding. The face within was blurred from wear, but the eyes, those eyes were clear. She let herself look, just for a moment, long enough to feel the weight press deeper into her chest. Then she tucked it back, close to her heart. And she rose. Because late or not, doubted or not, the fight wasn't over. Not for them, not for her. And when she stepped into the valley, her arrival, though delayed, would shift everything. What happens when a single shadow steps into a broken line? The valley was breaking apart. Soldiers crouched behind craters that crumbled under the pressure of incoming fire. Smoke coiled around them like a living thing, blinding their eyes, choking their throats. Radios screamed with overlapping orders no one could follow anymore. Chaos was winning, not because the enemy was stronger, but because fear had started to seep into the cracks of men's hearts. Then silence, brief but cutting. It came in the form of a single rifle shot, sharp and precise, cutting through the noise. One man on the line lifted his head just enough to notice the difference. That shot hadn't come from among them. It had come from the ridge. And the ridge meant her. At first, they didn't believe it. The younger ones thought maybe it was luck, just another soldier landing a lucky hit. But the veterans, the ones who had seen her work before, felt their chests tighten. "She's here," Sergeant Hale muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure anyone else heard him over the battle. No announcement, no dramatic entrance, just the steady rhythm of shots that found their marks with a kind of finality that couldn't be mistaken. Each crack of her rifle was like punctuation in the chaos, small, sharp reminders that precision still existed, that control hadn't completely slipped away. And slowly, the men on the ground began to breathe again. She lay prone on the ridge, cheek pressed against the worn stock of her rifle, her body aligned so perfectly it was as if the weapon and the woman were one. Through the scope, the valley stretched like a broken map, lines bent, cover scattered, shadows moving where they shouldn't. She adjusted her breath. In, out. The world slowed, narrowed. Her heartbeat was the only sound she acknowledged. One target, then another, then another. She wasn't here to win the battle with bullets. She was here to stitch a torn line back together with presence alone. But as steady as her hands were, her thoughts weren't. Why am I always too late? The question pressed against her with every trigger pull. She could feel it in the spaces between her breaths, in the silence that followed each shot. She thought of the photograph tucked against her chest, safe but heavy. The memory it carried burned brighter than the muzzle flash of her weapon. She wasn't late to the fight. She was late to a promise. And no amount of precision could erase that. Down in the valley, soldiers began to notice. A young private with dirt smeared across his face lifted his head from behind shattered cover. His eyes widened as he followed the direction of the rifle's echo. Relief flickered, faint but alive, and he whispered, "She came." Next to him, a medic pressed gauze against a wound that refused to close. Sweat trickled down her temple, her jaw locked with determination. She didn't look up, but she felt it, the rhythm of those shots easing the frantic pulse in her chest. Her patient opened his eyes, blood staining his lips, and for a fleeting second he smiled. "Told you she'd come." She didn't answer, but her hands steadied. Further down the line, the lieutenant in the command post grabbed the radio, his voice breaking with both frustration and relief. "Get me confirmation now. Is she on the ridge?" No one answered clearly, but everyone knew. Hale didn't need confirmation. He stepped out of the post and lifted his gaze toward the ridge. Smoke blurred the edges, but he knew her silhouette when he saw it. A thin line of pride tugged at his chest, though he masked it behind the drag of another cigarette. She hadn't abandoned them. She hadn't left them to write her into silence. And yet, Hale also knew something else. He'd seen the way she carried herself in the past, the way her silence wasn't just discipline but weight. She didn't fight for medals. She didn't fight for glory. She fought for something no one else was allowed to touch. And Hale wondered, not for the first time, what she was really chasing. She adjusted her scope again, catching the movement of 3 enemy units pushing toward the left flank. The line was seconds away from folding there. If it collapsed, the valley would swallow the entire battalion. Her fingers steadied on the trigger. 1, 2. The third ducked behind cover. She exhaled, waited. There, a glimpse of movement. She pulled the trigger. The line held barely. But she knew she couldn't stay on the ridge forever. A sniper's perch was powerful, but also temporary. The longer she stayed, the more predictable she became, and predictability meant death. She had to move. She had to join them. She slung the rifle across her back and began her descent, careful, controlled. Gravel slipped beneath her boots, but her steps remained deliberate. Every inch closer to the valley meant more than just closing distance. It meant stepping into their story. And that was the hardest part. On the ground, the young private who had whispered her arrival now pressed his back against a crater wall, clutching his rifle with trembling hands. His name was Marcus. Though few used it, names became fragile things out here. He was 19, barely old enough to grow a full beard, yet old enough to watch men die in his arms. As he reloaded his weapon with shaking fingers, he thought about home, about his sister's last letter, the one he hadn't answered because he didn't know what to say. What words could you send back to someone who still believed you were unbreakable? He flinched when another explosion rocked the ground, dirt raining across his helmet. He cursed too loud, his fear spilling over. Then he heard it again. Another clean rifle shot slicing through the chaos. His chest loosened, just a fraction. "She's here," he told himself again, louder this time, as if repeating it made it more true. She reached the edge of the valley floor, crouching low behind a jagged outcrop. The sound here was deafening, constant thunder of artillery, the hiss of radio static, the sharp cries of orders, and the sharper silence of those who no longer spoke. Her pulse quickened, not from fear but from something more dangerous, the pull of memory. Every sound here was familiar. Every echo reminded her of another valley, another line that had broken, another moment when she had been too late. And in that memory was a face she could never forget. She shoved it down. Not now, not here. If she let memory win, she'd falter, and faltering meant others would pay the price. She pressed her back against the rock, closing her eyes for a breath, letting the dirt and smoke sting her lungs. Then she opened them again, steady, sharp. She moved. By the time she reached the closest group of soldiers, their eyes were wide, some with disbelief, others with something closer to shame. They had doubted her. They had whispered she wouldn't come. And yet here she was, boots caked in dust, rifle steady across her chest, eyes burning with a focus they couldn't look away from. No words passed between them. None were needed. She dropped beside the medic, who glanced up just long enough to meet her gaze. Something silent passed between them, not gratitude, not relief, but acknowledgement. Two women in a place that rarely remembered them, two women carrying burdens heavier than anyone else would see. She steadied the wounded man's rifle, her hands sure, her movements calm. And with that, the line that had been breaking began, slowly, to hold. But in the back of her mind, one thought whispered still. "I should have been here sooner." The photograph pressed against her chest, as if to remind her. And though no one around her knew, though the men lifted their heads higher, steadied their breaths, found their courage again because of her presence, she knew the truth. Her arrival hadn't erased her lateness. And one day, maybe soon, she'd have to face what that really meant. What changes when a single woman steps into a crumbling line? Not the weapons, not the maps, not the numbers. Those remained the same, steel, smoke, and statistics scribbled on paper no one trusted anymore. What changed was breath. The way men inhaled differently when she crouched beside them. The way hands that trembled before steadied just enough to reload. The way silence between explosions began to feel less like doom and more like possibility. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was enough. But inside her chest, there was no calm. She pressed her shoulder against the shattered wall of a burned-out vehicle, scanning the ridgeline through her scope. Her heart beat in measured thuds, her breath even, her hands precise. On the outside, she was a machine of discipline. On the inside, the voice whispered again, "Too late." The medic beside her adjusted pressure on the wounded soldier's bandage. Blood had seeped through, dark and sticky, staining her gloves and soaking into the earth beneath them. "Stay with me," the medic murmured, her tone steady, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion pulling at her. The soldier coughed, lips stained red. His gaze drifted toward the woman who had just arrived. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes, recognition, disbelief, maybe even gratitude. But it faded as his chest heaved once more. The medic worked faster, biting down on her lip, refusing to let fear slip through her hands. The woman steadied her rifle across the edge of the vehicle, firing 2 clean shots in rhythm, clearing a path in front of them. She didn't look at the medic, but her presence was answer enough. They were not alone. On the far side of the valley, Marcus, the 19-year-old private, watched her through the haze. His lungs still burned, his body still trembled, but his eyes clung to her movements. She was deliberate, efficient, calm. And he thought of his sister again. She had written in her last letter, "Don't try to be a hero, just come home." But watching the woman in front of him, Marcus wondered if coming home was ever really possible for people like her. She didn't look like someone who belonged anywhere else. She looked like someone who only existed here, in the dirt, in the fire, in the silence between shots. Marcus lowered his head back behind cover, clutching his rifle. He whispered his sister's words again, but this time they sounded hollow. At the command post, Hale leaned against the steel table, eyes narrowed toward the smoke. He had no line of sight, but he didn't need one. He felt the shift already. The frantic edge in the radio chatter softened. Orders carried weight again instead of panic. Men began reporting positions instead of prayers. The lieutenant still paced, his nerves too raw to settle. "She won't hold the line alone," he snapped. Hale exhaled smoke, his tone even. "She doesn't need to, she just reminds them they can." The lieutenant stopped, staring at him, confusion etched across his face. He wanted logic, numbers, strategies. Hale offered none, just faith. And in war, faith was sometimes the sharpest weapon. She moved again, crawling low across broken ground to another cluster of soldiers. Dirt pressed into her palms, smoke burned her throat, the air quivered with the percussion of shells slamming too close. She ignored it all. She had learned long ago that chaos only had power if you gave it your attention. The men she joined didn't speak at first, they just looked at her. Their helmets were dented, their uniforms torn, their faces streaked with grime and fear. One nodded, a small movement, more prayer than greeting. She nodded back, setting her rifle against the rubble. Her eyes swept the horizon, quick and calculated. Enemy positions marked themselves in her vision like ghosts. She steadied her weapon, breath aligned with her heartbeat. Trigger squeeze, crack, one down. Trigger squeeze, crack, another. The soldiers around her didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their spines straightened, their grips tightened. It was enough. But even as the valley steadied, she felt the weight pressing harder inside her. The photograph burned against her chest. Every shot she fired was a reminder. Every inch of dirt she crawled across was a repetition. She wasn't just fighting this battle. She was chasing one she had already lost. Her mind slipped, just for a second, into memory. A different valley, a different dawn. The sound of her name shouted through static. A line breaking, men falling, the scream of artillery tearing open the world. And through it all, a face she hadn't reached in time. She blinked hard, forcing the memory back. Not now, not yet. Her jaw locked as she fired again, anchoring herself to the present. But deep inside, the truth clawed. No matter how many lives she saved today, she would always be arriving too late for the one that mattered most. The medic caught her glance in a rare pause. Their eyes held for a second longer than necessary. The medic didn't ask questions, she didn't need to. She had her own ghosts, carried in silence. "Keep them steady," the medic said finally, her voice low, pointing to the soldier she worked on. The woman nodded. She shifted her position, providing cover, her rifle barking in short, efficient bursts. Each shot kept the medic's hands working, kept the soldier breathing a little longer. And for a fleeting instant, she felt something stir inside her chest. Not hope, not pride, but a fragile echo of purpose. Marcus crawled closer, dirt smearing across his face. His rifle clattered awkwardly against the ground, betraying his inexperience. "Ma'am," he started, but his voice cracked. He swallowed hard, trying again. You saved our flank." She didn't look at him, her eyes still on the scope, but her voice, when it came, was calm and even. "Stay low, breathe with the ground, don't rush your shots." Marcus blinked, caught off guard by her tone. It wasn't sharp, wasn't dismissive. It was steady, grounding. He nodded quickly, pressing himself flatter into the dirt, mimicking her posture. His hands stopped shaking, not because the fear was gone, but because he had something to follow. Time moved strangely in the valley. Seconds stretched into lifetimes between shots. Minutes disappeared in smoke and fire. She lost track of how many she had taken down. Numbers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the line, holding, breathing, refusing to collapse. And though doubt still clawed at her ribs, though the voice still whispered too late, she could feel something shifting around her. Not victory, not yet, but survival. And in war, sometimes survival was the sharpest kind of defiance. As night threatened to fall across the valley, the fire slowed. The enemy pulled back, not defeated, but pausing. Smoke settled into the air, heavy and sour. The soldiers slumped against cover, chests heaving, faces hollow. No cheers, no laughter, just silence, the kind that followed storms. She lowered her rifle, her muscles aching, her throat raw. She glanced at the medic, who finally let her shoulders sag. The wounded man still breathed, shallow, uneven, but alive. Marcus collapsed into the dirt, helmet tilted back, eyes staring at the darkening sky. He whispered something to himself, maybe his sister's name, maybe a prayer. And Hale, back at the post, leaned against the wall, exhaling smoke into the cooling air. He knew it wasn't over. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but for now the line had held. Because she came. But as she sat against the rubble, wiping dust from her face, she felt no victory. Only the photograph against her chest, heavier than ever. Because battles could be won, lines could be held, men could be saved. But the one she had been too late for would never return. And that truth, no matter how silent, was always waiting in the shadows. Night fell unevenly in the valley, like a shroud pulled across a broken body. The smoke lingered, glowing faintly in the dim light of the moon. Fires smoldered in patches, giving off just enough illumination to paint the jagged shapes of rubble, twisted metal, and exhausted men who looked more like shadows than soldiers. The battle had slowed, but silence never meant safety. Everyone knew the enemy was still out there, just beyond the ridgeline, waiting, listening, preparing. She sat with her back to a collapsed wall, rifle balanced across her knees. Her face was streaked with dust, her eyes darkened by the weight of what they had endured. She had fought through the day, through the haze and noise, through the gnawing ache of memory that pressed against her chest with every breath. And now, in the stillness, the voice was louder. Too late, always too late. She closed her eyes briefly, pressing her gloved hand against the pocket where the photograph lay. She didn't take it out, not here, not now. But she could see it as clearly as if it were in front of her, the face, the smile, the life she had not saved. Around her, the remnants of the platoon settled into uneasy positions. Some leaned against rubble, rifles across their laps. Others huddled near the medic, whispering in low tones, words too quiet to carry. Marcus sat not far away, helmet tilted forward, eyes half closed but refusing to surrender to sleep. Every soldier knew rest was dangerous. The night was when mistakes were made, when exhaustion cracked discipline, when fear crept in like a slow poison. The medic worked quietly, hands steady even in the dim light. She checked bandages, adjusted splints, wiped sweat from the foreheads of the wounded. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words carried a softness rare in places like this. A softness that reminded the men they were still human. The woman watched her for a moment, admiring the quiet resilience. Some battles weren't fought with rifles or grenades. Some were fought with bandages, with whispered reassurances, with the stubborn refusal to let the dying slip away. Marcus shifted, glancing toward her. He hesitated, chewing his lip before finally speaking. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice almost lost in the night. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. He swallowed, words tumbling out awkwardly. I wanted to say, I've never seen anyone fight like you. Not in training, not in the stories the older guys tell." Her gaze held his for a moment, then drifted back toward the horizon. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady. "You fight when you have to, that's all." Marcus frowned, unsatisfied. "No, it's more than that. The way you move, the way everyone listens when you're near, it's like," he struggled for the right word, "like you carry something they don't." Her jaw tightened, she didn't answer. Because he was right. She did carry something. something heavier than a rifle, heavier than the guilt that gnawed at her in the dark. But it wasn't a burden she intended to share. Not with him, not with anyone. Nearby, two older soldiers murmured quietly, their voices barely more than gravel carried on the wind. They weren't speaking of tactics or maps. They spoke of home. One described his daughter's first steps, how he had missed them, how she would be walking by the time he returned. The other spoke of his wife's letters, how the words smelled faintly of lavender when the envelope was first torn open. Their voices cracked in places, not from fear but from longing. The kind of longing that didn't fit neatly into a battlefield, that felt foreign against the backdrop of ruin. She listened without meaning to, and though she kept her eyes on the horizon, her chest tightened, because their words reminded her of what she had lost, of the voice she would never hear again, the touch she would never feel, the life she had let slip through her fingers. The medic finally broke the silence, her voice low but firm. "They'll come again before dawn. They always do." The men stirred uneasily, shifting in their places. No one doubted her. She had seen enough battlefields to know the rhythm of war. Night was not reprieve, it was interlude. The woman nodded slowly, adjusting the rifle on her lap. She would be ready. She always was. But readiness didn't erase the exhaustion gnawing at her bones, the memories clawing at her thoughts. She tilted her head back against the wall, closing her eyes briefly. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw it again. The valley from before. The smoke, the screams, the desperate call for help. Her boots pounding against the dirt as she ran, too far, too slow. The explosion that tore the air apart. And when she reached him, she opened her eyes sharply, forcing the memory back. Not now, not here. Marcus's voice broke the silence again, softer this time. "My sister, she told me not to try to be a hero, just come home." His words trembled in the night air, fragile and honest. The woman glanced at him, her expression unreadable. She wanted to tell him there were no heroes, that heroism was just another word for survival written in someone else's history book, but she stayed silent. Instead, the medic spoke, her tone firm. "Listen to your sister. Coming home is the hardest thing any of us can do." The men around her nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. The woman said nothing, because for her, coming home was no longer possible. Hours stretched into uneasy stillness. The night pressed heavy on the valley, every creak of metal and rustle of fabric amplified in the silence. The soldiers rotated watches, their eyes scanning the ridgeline, their ears straining for the faintest sound of movement. Sleep came in fragments, minutes stolen against rubble, dreams shattered by the echo of distant fire. And through it all she sat steady, eyes unblinking, rifle across her knees. She didn't sleep, she didn't dare. Because in the silence of night, the voice was louder. Too late, too late. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the photograph through the fabric. She didn't take it out. She didn't need to. Its weight was enough. Just before dawn, when the sky was still bruised with the color of night, the first sound came. A branch snapping, a rock tumbling, too deliberate to be chance. The soldiers tensed, hands tightening on their rifles. The medic froze, her hands hovering over the bandages. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The woman lifted her weapon, eyes narrowing through the scope. The horizon blurred into the faintest suggestion of movement, shadows slipping through shadows. "They're here," she whispered, her voice calm, unshaken. And in that moment the exhaustion vanished. The memories receded. The photograph against her chest was still there, heavy and relentless, but her focus sharpened. The line would hold, because it had to. Because she had already been too late once. And she refused to be too late again. Dawn didn't arrive gently. It broke jagged and raw, the first streaks of pale light cutting across the valley, illuminating smoke and ruin. The sky wasn't soft pink or warm gold. It was the color of ash, muted and heavy, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over such a place. The soldiers stirred with it, bodies stiff from sleepless hours, nerves drawn taut as wires. Weapons checked, bandages tightened, breaths held. The world seemed to balance on a knife's edge, every sound amplified. And then it came. The crack of a rifle, distant, sharp, followed by another. Then silence. No one moved, no one breathed. The woman crouched low, eyes narrowing through her scope. The ridgeline blurred, then shifted. Shapes emerged where moments ago there had been none. "They're pushing," she said quietly, calm, inevitable. Marcus tightened his grip on his rifle. The medic steadied herself beside the wounded. The older soldiers exchanged a glance, weary, resigned. And just like that, the valley came alive again. The first volley slammed into the rubble, shards of stone and dust exploding into the air. Men ducked, cursing, returning fire in bursts that echoed off the walls of the valley. The woman stayed steady. Her finger flexed, her eyes sharp behind the scope. She exhaled slowly, blocking out the noise, the chaos, the pounding of her heart. One shot, a figure collapsed on the ridgeline. Another shot, a second shadow crumpled. She didn't miss. She couldn't afford to. But with every pull of the trigger, the voice pressed closer. Too late, too late. She forced it back, focusing on the rhythm. Exhale, fire, adjust, fire. The discipline drilled into her bones carried her forward, even as the past threatened to drag her under. The enemy's advance grew heavier. Shadows slipped closer, darting between rocks, firing from cover. The platoon fought back with grit and desperation, holding ground inch by inch. Marcus fired until his hands shook. His voice cracked with each shouted warning, each call for cover. His fear was raw, unpolished, but he didn't break. The medic moved like a phantom, dragging the wounded behind what little cover remained. Hands slick with blood, face pale but unshaken. She whispered encouragements no one could hear. Words meant only for the dying, words to keep them tethered a little longer. And the woman, she was the anchor. Her presence cut through the chaos, her shots carving space where there was none, her voice low and certain when orders fractured. The men steadied when she spoke. They followed without hesitation. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded it. Because she carried something they couldn't name. But then came the blast. A mortar shell screamed through the air, tearing the ground open not 20 feet from their position. The explosion shook the valley, hurling men against stone, filling the air with choking dust. Marcus cried out, clutching his shoulder. The medic was already moving, dragging him to cover, hands pressing hard against the wound. The woman's ears rang, vision blurred. For a moment the valley dissolved, not into silence but into memory. The explosion wasn't here, it was then. The valley from before. The smoke, the fire, the voice calling her name, her legs burning as she ran, too far, too slow. And when she reached him, "Ma'am!" Marcus's voice snapped her back. His face pale, his eyes wide, blood staining his uniform. She blinked hard, forced her breath steady. Not now, not again. Her rifle snapped up, the world sharpened. The enemy surged closer. Grenades arced overhead, detonating against the rubble. Shouts echoed through the valley. The line threatened to buckle. But she refused to let it. Her voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Hold the flank, keep them pinned." The men rallied, their fire intensifying, their movement steadier. Marcus, bleeding but alive, forced himself to fire one-handed, teeth gritted against the pain. The medic shouted for cover, dragging another wounded man out of the kill zone. Her hands never stopped moving, never stopped fighting in her own way. The woman crouched lower, her eye locked on the ridgeline. She fired again and again, each shot deliberate, each shot a promise. Not this time, not too late. Minutes stretched like hours. The battle became a blur of dust, fire, and shouted orders. And then, as quickly as it began, the push faltered. The enemy retreated, shadows pulling back across the ridgeline, fire slackening. silence creeping in like a slow tide. The valley stilled, smoke curled into the pale morning sky. The soldiers slumped against rubble, chests heaving, faces streaked with sweat and blood. Marcus leaned back, eyes fluttering, his breathing ragged but steady. The medic pressed a firm hand against his wound, her voice low and calm. "We're not done," the woman said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, not even to herself, just to the valley, to the ghosts that lingered there. Later, when the smoke had thinned and the wounded had been tended, the men settled into uneasy silence. Some whispered, others stared blankly at the ground. The woman sat apart, rifle across her knees, eyes scanning the horizon. Marcus shifted weakly, his voice hoarse. "You saved us." She didn't look at him. "You saved me," he insisted. Her grip tightened on the rifle. The photograph pressed against her chest, its edges sharp against her skin. She shook her head slowly. "Not yet." Marcus frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't for him. The truth was a memory, a name, a promise she had broken once and refused to break again. The medic eased down beside her, hands still stained, eyes heavy but clear. "You carry it, don't you?" she said softly. The woman's eyes flicked toward her. "The weight," the medic continued. "We all do, some louder than others." The woman didn't reply. The medic didn't press. She only sighed, leaning back against the rubble. "Don't let it bury you. The dead don't need us to break for them. The living do." The words lingered in the air, heavier than gunfire. The woman closed her eyes briefly. For a moment the voice quieted. But only for a moment. As the morning stretched on, the men rebuilt what cover they could. Ammunition was rationed, positions reinforced. Every movement was mechanical, routine. The valley was never safe. And yet within that fragile silence, something shifted. The soldiers glanced toward her more often, not with doubt, not with suspicion. With trust. The kind born not of rank or command, but of presence, of steadiness, of someone who stood when others faltered. She didn't ask for it, she didn't want it. But it came all the same. And though she never smiled, never softened, a flicker of something passed across her face. Not pride, not relief. Determination. Because the battle wasn't over. And because, for the first time since that day, she wondered if she might not be too late after all. The valley seemed quieter after the morning assault, but quiet was always a lie. Smoke drifted lazily, the air thick with the acrid sting of burnt powder. The wounded groaned softly, tended by hands that never stopped moving. The living clutched their rifles like lifelines, eyes darting to the ridgeline as though the enemy might spill over it again at any moment. She sat in the shadow of a broken wall, helmet beside her, rifle balanced across her knees. Her face was still streaked with dust, her eyes dark from sleeplessness, but her posture was steady, almost unnaturally so. Inside, though, the weight pressed harder. Because with every glance cast her way, every flicker of trust in their eyes, the lie grew heavier. She wasn't steady, not really. She was cracked, and though the cracks didn't show on her face, she felt them with every breath. Marcus shifted beside her, wincing as he leaned against the rubble. His bandage was dark with blood, but the medic said he would live. He looked younger than he had the day before, worn down, stripped of the false bravado that had clung to him when he first followed orders into this valley. "You ever think about it?" he asked suddenly, his voice hoarse. She turned her head slightly. "About what?" He shrugged, grimacing. "Why we're still here, why we made it out when so many didn't." She studied him, saying nothing at first, then every day. Marcus nodded faintly, as though he expected that answer. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, his eyes glassy with fatigue. "My sister, she's waiting back home. She made me promise I'd write after every mission. I didn't this time. Couldn't, felt like if I did, it'd make it real, like—" His voice trailed off. He shook his head. Stupid. It's not stupid, she said quietly. He looked at her then. Do you write? Her eyes flicked down to her chest, where the photograph pressed against her heart like a blade. She forced her gaze back up. No, she said flatly. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. The medic approached, wiping her hands on a rag already stained beyond saving. Her face was pale, her movements deliberate, but her eyes, those carried a steadiness born not of absence, but of choice. You need rest, she told the woman. I'll rest later. The medic tilted her head. Later may not come. Silence stretched between them. Around them, the men dozed in shifts, the valley settling into uneasy half-sleep. Finally, the medic sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You fight like someone who's already lost, she said softly. The woman's jaw tightened. She didn't look at her. The medic's voice stayed gentle. You carry it, don't you? A name, a face. The photograph burned against her chest. She felt her pulse throb in her throat. But she didn't answer. Because to say the name would be to open the wound. And if she opened it now, she wasn't sure she'd survive the bleeding. The hours crawled. Shadows shifted with the sun, the air growing hotter, heavier. The men drank sparingly, their rations dwindling. No one spoke much. Words felt wasteful in a place like this. But silence had its own weight. It pressed on her, louder than gunfire. In the stillness, the voice grew stronger, the memory clearer. Too late, always too late. She closed her eyes briefly, pressing her hand against her chest. She could almost hear him again, calling her name, waiting. And the moment she had failed him. Her throat tightened. She forced her eyes open, scanning the horizon, anchoring herself to the now, to the men who needed her, to the battle not yet finished. Because if she let herself fall into the memory, she might not climb back out. When dusk finally came, it carried with it a strange intimacy. The men gathered near the remnants of a fire, their faces ghostly in the dim light. They shared scraps of stories, half-hearted jokes, whispered confessions too fragile for daylight. One man spoke of the first time he held his newborn son, another of the letter he never sent to the woman he loved. Their voices cracked in places, not from weakness, but from the rawness of truths rarely spoken aloud. She sat slightly apart, listening but not joining. Until Marcus shifted, his gaze settling on her. "What about you, ma'am?" he asked. The firelight flickered across her face. For a moment she said nothing. "What about me?" He swallowed, hesitant but insistent. "What do you go back to, when this is over, when you're home?" The men quieted. Even the fire seemed to soften. Her chest tightened. The photograph burned against her. She could lie, she could say nothing. But the silence stretched too long. Finally her voice came low, almost a whisper. "There is no home." The men looked at her, waiting. Her hands tightened on the rifle. She stared into the fire. "There was someone," she said slowly. "I was supposed to be there, I was." Her voice faltered, barely audible. "I was too late." The fire popped softly. No one spoke. Not out of judgment, out of respect. Because in that moment they understood. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was grief carved into bone. The medic reached out, resting a hand lightly on her arm. Not pushing, just grounding. "You're not too late for them," she said quietly, nodding toward the men. The woman's throat tightened. She didn't answer. But she didn't pull away either. Night deepened. The fire dwindled. One by one, the men drifted into uneasy sleep. She stayed awake, eyes on the horizon, rifle across her knees. The medic eventually rose, moving to check the wounded. Marcus dozed, his breathing uneven but steady. And she remained. Because sleep was dangerous, and because the past waited for her there. She tilted her head back, staring at the dark sky. Stars flickered faintly through the haze. And for the first time in a long while, She let the name pass through her mind without resistance. Not aloud, not for anyone else. Just for herself. And though the ache sharpened, something softened with it. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the smallest shift. As though the weight might one day be carried, not just endured. Her eyes lowered back to the valley, steady again. The battle wasn't over. The enemy would return. She knew it as surely as she knew her own heartbeat. But now, when the men looked at her, when Marcus glanced her way, when the medic lingered nearby, the silence inside her didn't feel quite as hollow. She was still broken, still carrying the voice. But for the first time since that day, she wasn't carrying it alone. The night air pressed heavy against her skin as if the desert itself had been holding its breath, waiting for her decision. She crouched in the ruins of an old stone wall, her rifle steady on the crumbling edge. Through the scope, the compound seemed almost still, too still. Lanterns flickered inside, shadows shifted, but it was the silence, the absence of the usual careless chatter, the clatter of weapons that told her everything. They were ready, waiting, expecting someone, maybe her. Her finger hovered just outside the trigger guard. She could feel the pulse in her hands, the old rhythm she had learned to control years ago. Breathe in, hold, exhale, still. Her body was a machine built for this moment, but her heart was not. Somewhere deep, she still asked herself, why am I here again? Why didn't I walk away when I had the chance? The headset buzzed faintly, a man's voice, rough and tired. Shadow One status. It was Ramirez, always steady, always the anchor. She didn't answer right away. She let the question hang in the silence, her eyes fixed on the glowing doorway of the compound. I'm in position, she finally whispered. I see movement, they know we're coming. There was a pause on the other end. Not doubt, not fear, just a beat of shared understanding. They'd all been here before, but what Ramirez said next cut sharper than she expected. Copy. Remember, you don't have to prove anything tonight. She swallowed hard, lips dry. The words sank into her like gravel. He was wrong, she did have to prove something. Maybe not to him, not even to the team, but to herself. To the ghost of her brother who still haunted her every time she closed her eyes. Through the scope, a man appeared in the doorway. Tall, carrying a rifle low, scanning the horizon. Her crosshairs traced his chest, then his throat, then the space between his eyes. Her breathing slowed, narrowed to a single point of focus. And yet, her finger stayed still. What if she missed? What if she gave away their position too soon? What if tonight was just another night where she failed to protect someone, failed to end the cycle before it began? Her chest tightened, her mind spiraled. She blinked hard, forcing the memories back into their locked box. The last time she hesitated, she had lost someone. She couldn't afford that again. Not tonight. Not when everything balanced on her shot. Shadow One, Ramirez whispered again, softer this time. We're with you. She took the shot. The crack echoed off the broken stones. The figure in the doorway dropped soundlessly, swallowed by shadow before his rifle even hit the ground. And in that silence, something shifted, not just in the compound, not just in the mission, but inside her. The weight of hesitation lifted, replaced by the cold certainty of what came next. Then the compound erupted. Shouts tore through the night. Lights flared. The sound of boots thundered against the earth, and for the first time the enemy realized she was there. But so did her team. Target down, she breathed, her voice steady now, sharper, more certain. Shadow One is in play. For a heartbeat she let the words hang. A declaration, a promise. And though no one could see her in the dark, a faint fire lit behind her eyes. She wasn't late, she wasn't forgotten. She was here, and everything was about to change. The valley held its breath. Smoke curled against the dawn, painting the rocks and rubble in muted gold. The acrid scent of spent ammunition mixed with the soft, wet smell of dust and sweat. Every soldier moved with quiet precision, aware that the calm was a lie, that every heartbeat carried both life and risk. She crouched behind a jagged wall, rifle resting on her forearm, eyes scanning. The first assault had been repelled, but the enemy's shadows lingered on the ridgeline, moving deliberately, calculating. Her team was stretched thin. Marcus, still pale and bandaged, clutched his rifle with shaky hands. The medic adjusted splints, murmuring soft reassurances that sounded more like prayers than orders. And in the center of it all she breathed, deep, measured, steady, every breath an anchor, every heartbeat a promise. Because she was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something higher, for trust, for redemption, for the memory she carried like a second skin. A shout tore through the air. The enemy had broken cover, a flurry of movement against the rising sun. Boots pounded, rifles cracked. The valley erupted again, and this time there was no hesitation, no pause. She moved first, not because she led, not because she demanded it, but because she had to. Her rifle barked in the early light, each shot precise, deliberate, controlled. Shadows fell where she aimed. The men followed her rhythm, firing in tandem, moving as though guided by an invisible line only she could see. Marcus's breathing was ragged, but he fired alongside her, hands steadier now, guided by the confidence she radiated without speaking. The medic moved among the wounded, dragging them to safety while speaking softly, grounding them in the reality that they were still alive. And through it all, she carried the photograph against her chest, its weight grounding her even as it reminded her of failure. She reached the center of the valley, crouching behind a broken wall as an enemy soldier crested the ridge. The man froze, recognizing the shot that had felled his comrade moments before. Her finger squeezed the trigger, but this time her mind flared with hesitation. Too late, too late. The memory surged, vivid and raw, the past battle, the friend she couldn't save, the scream, the explosion. Her chest tightened and she wavered. Then she felt it, the team behind her breathing as one, trusting her to act. The medic's soft glance, Marcus's tentative nod, the silent pulse of the valley itself. Her hand steadied. She took the shot. The figure dropped. Silence returned, broken only by the wind brushing against the rocks. And in that silence, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe. Maybe she wasn't too late. The battle raged for hours, but their coordination held. Each movement was a conversation of trust. No shouting, no chaos, just the quiet understanding between soldiers who had survived together. She moved among them like a shadow, giving space, offering guidance, steadying nerves. Marcus finally laughed quietly at a small victory, a sound fragile and human. She allowed herself a brief smile in return, fleeting but genuine. It wasn't pride. Not yet. It was acknowledgement, recognition that even in war, humanity persisted. The medic clapped Marcus on the shoulder. See, you survived because you kept your head, and because she showed you how. Marcus glanced at her. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't need to. The lesson wasn't about her. It was about the line they all held together. Hours later, the enemy had withdrawn. The valley was scarred, littered with debris and smoke, but it was theirs, held against impossible odds. The soldiers gathered, silent, breathing heavily, staring at one another and the expanse they had defended. Marcus leaned against a rock, bandages soaked but steady. The medic checked the wounded one last time, her face lined with exhaustion but calm. And she stood apart, photograph pressed to her chest, staring at the horizon. The sun had fully risen. Its light struck the valley with a harsh beauty, illuminating dust particles like sparks. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself feel something more than memory or guilt. Hope. Hale arrived at the valley as the men began to regroup. He didn't speak immediately, just surveyed the scene, the exhausted, the wounded, the standing, the fallen. And then his eyes found her. You held them, he said simply. She didn't answer. Her hands pressed the photograph tighter. You didn't just fight, he continued. You reminded them why they fight, why any of us fight. Her jaw tightened. Words felt too fragile. Actions spoke louder. And in that moment she realized he was right. Not about her, about all of them. The soldiers began to dismantle temporary positions, gathering supplies, attending to the wounded. She moved through them silently, checking, steadying, correcting. Every small gesture carried weight, each bandage, each whispered encouragement, each patient instruction a continuation of the promise she had silently made. Marcus approached her finally, face smudged with dirt, eyes wary but bright. "Ma'am," he said, voice quiet, you saved us. I don't know how to say thanks." She allowed herself to look at him, really look for the first time in hours. Not with judgment, not with expectation. "You don't need to," she said softly. "Just live, that's all I ask." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I will, I promise." And in the quiet between them, the valley seemed to hold its breath again, not with fear this time, but with relief. The sun climbed higher. Dust and smoke mingled in the light, creating the illusion of a battlefield both real and unreal, a place suspended between memory and reality. She finally allowed herself to exhale fully. The weight of the photograph pressed against her chest, sharp and cold, but she didn't hide it. She didn't turn away. Instead, she let it rest there, a reminder not of failure but of purpose. Sometimes, she realized, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. She stood, stretching, rifle slung across her back. The soldiers looked to her instinctively, and she nodded once, a simple gesture enough. Not a hero's triumph, not a victory lap, just a line held, lives preserved, and the quiet knowledge that she had arrived when it mattered. As the team moved out of the valley, dust trailing in the rising sun, she walked beside them, shadow among shadows, not above or behind. Marcus glanced at her again, words unsaid but gratitude clear. She met his gaze for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a promise kept, a lesson learned, a line held. The wind stirred the dust at her feet. Somewhere in the quiet, the valley whispered its approval. She paused briefly, looking back over the terrain they had defended, over the lives they had protected, over the silence that now stretched between them and the ghosts of the past. The photograph pressed to her chest, and she let herself finally exhale, not in relief, not in celebration, but in recognition. She had arrived. She had not failed. And in that quiet, lasting moment, the valley held its own breath. A line drawn in dust and blood, unbroken. The sun rose higher, warming the scars of battle. And she walked forward,